It's
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this month's edition of Real World Parenting. Tonight's topic is a very popular topic, and I think those of us who are parents, work with kids, boy, do we feel it. So today's topic is discipline strategies that actually work with kids. First off, I'm Pam Evans. I head up the marketing and development for Family Service and Guidance Center, and we're here in Topeka, and just so glad that you joined us tonight. As you may know, Family Service and Guidance Center specializes in treating kids who might be struggling with mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, ADHD, and we also provide mental health crisis services to kids up to the age of 18. We're very proud to be offering this service, these free conversations to the public, because we know how hard it is, especially, in the past 18 months. So thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us. A couple of housekeeping things. If you need a certificate of attendance, of completion, whatnot, please feel free to drop your first and last name in the chat, and we'll make sure we get that emailed to you tomorrow. So please do that, and please note we are recording this session, so just wanted to make you aware of that as well. And so if you have some friends, fellow parents, guardians that missed it, we will be posting this recording on the FSGC website, and I'll tell you about that, where you can find that after the presentation. So no further ado, I want to introduce you to our conversation leader today. It is Dr. Abby Callis. She is FSGC's Director of Quality, Outcomes, and Training. So Abby, I'm going to turn it over to you. And could you start us off by just telling us a little bit about yourself, and then heck, let's jump right in.
Yes, will do. So my name again is Abby. Like Pam said, I'm one of the directors at Family Service. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been at Family Service about 16 years. So I do a lot of work around different types of parenting and behavioral planning, in particular with kids who have anxiety. So we'll talk about a lot of different things tonight. I'm obviously at my home. So just as an FYI, I do have dogs. Apologize in advance if they happen to bark, but I always like to just give that warning. I'm gonna quickly share screen just so I can show you a few slides. Hold on, sorry, I had to unmute myself. I realized we muted, but I had to unmute myself. So I don't think you missed anything. I was just saying I was sharing some slides really quickly. And I will then move into the questions. I got a lot of really great questions for everyone. So I think I will try to hit them all. Please drop a question in the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question. Stop me if you want me to go into more detail. But I will be trying to hit everything that you have asked me, and so we can have a conversation and get into some more specifics, hopefully, with this in this hour. First thing I want to say is that this is obviously very hard work. Growing children is a very hard thing to do. And I'm going to be talking in a little bit of black and whites and a little bit of generalities tonight. And every strategy does not work for every child in every situation. So some of the things I say will have to be altered a little bit to make sense for your kiddo in a particular situation and some things like that, which is why I want you to hopefully have you ask me some specific questions as we get into a little more of the detail. But as we talk tonight, I have a few points to remember that are just sort of general rules of thumb when it comes to disciplining a child when they're having some trouble with their behavior. And one of the first is that we know as providers that positive reinforcement is usually more successful for modifying behavior than punishment. And I'm going to talk about what both of those mean. and how to decide between the two. And so the first one is that the concept of positive reinforcement is really just a fancy way to say that you reward something you want. So if my boss wants me to do more presentations like this, they give me more chocolate. I am getting a reward for doing something, and then I am more likely to do that thing again. And that's really all positive reinforcement is. So as an example, every time we get a paycheck for going to work, that is technically a positive reinforcement. Whether we want to go to work or not, we're more likely to do it because somebody gave us something we wanted. That is positive reinforcement. The concept of reinforcement simply means that it's more likely to happen in the future. So when I give somebody something, they are more likely to do basically some sort of behavior again. The contrast to that is punishment, which is when you present or add an aversive stimulus after a behavior in order to make it not happen again. So it's really almost the reverse of a positive reinforcement. So you're still applying something to your child, but it's something they don't want. So that would mean if my boss thought, don't ever do a presentation again, they might take away my paycheck because I did this presentation. I'm not going to do presentations anymore if you take away my paycheck. So punishment is basically that. The problem with the use of punishment when it comes to most children is that if we accidentally do it in a way that turns into reinforcement, we actually end up reinforcing the behavior. And I'm going to talk about that in some of the specific question and examples. So I will come back to that one. Another sort of rule of thumb or point to remember is never underestimating the power of removing a very young child from the situation or the behavior you don't like or you don't want them to do. That's a very powerful reinforcement for very little children. So literally picking them up and moving them away from the thing that you don't want them to do. Another really important point to remember is that if a child has done something that you don't like, or they have melted down and they're misbehaving, in the moment is never a good time to talk about the situation because they're not going to be hearing you in any way that's helpful. And there's some brain reasons for that. The brain just doesn't hear in the same way it does when you're calm. So always come back to discussing something that has occurred after everybody is calmed down, parents included. The next kind of point of thumb is, or rule of thumb, is when possible to make some sort of logical connection between the behavior and the consequences. So I've got a lot of specific examples of this coming up as well. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but basically what I mean is that when these things are connected together very well, it's a stronger connection. So if my positive reinforcement or my punishment makes sense in the context of the behavior, it's more likely to have a really strong effect. So as an example, let's say that you tell your child to clean up the Legos and they refuse to do it, then the Legos go away. So if you tell them not to, like if you take away their dessert because they didn't clean up the Legos, that is not as strong a connection as losing Legos because you refused to pick up Legos. And I will talk more about that, but that logical connection helps make your interventions, your efforts to discipline stronger in terms of changing their behavior. Another thing that's probably going to come up again later, but I want to mention really quickly, is that timeout is often thought of as a punishment. People think of timeout as punishment, but it doesn't have to be used solely in that way. Timeout is also a really great time to teach a child how to calm themselves down. Adults sort of do this naturally. If we get upset and then we leave the room and go listen to music for a while, we've essentially put ourselves in timeout. So we want to kind of rethink sometimes timeout as this method of letting a kid calm down, not necessarily punishing them for behavior. And then it's obviously something you've probably thought of many times before, but any sort of really harsh or negative type of discipline, like belittling or calling a child not as good because they're not as well behaved as a different child, those usually do not have the desired effect. Doesn't normally change the negative behavior you'd like to get rid of. Another one is that all of the behavior that people engage in, whether they're children or adults, it has meaning. Even when it doesn't make sense to us, it means something. And in many cases, behavior, particularly in young people, is to serve a purpose. It does something for them. It either meets a need, it means they don't have to do something they don't want to do, but behavior always has a meaning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as time goes on as well. The other piece that's sort of attached to that fact that behavior has meaning is that behavior is not always a choice. For children and again adults, but we're talking about children today. The behaviors that you see your child engage in, sometimes they're choosing to do it. They're actively looking at you and saying no, and they know they're going to get in trouble for that. At other times, it's simply a reaction and they are not in control of themselves. And I will talk about disciplining both types of that behavior. The last 2 or 3 that I want to mention is related. One is related to an age-appropriate length of timeout. General rule of thumb is 1 minute for every year of age. So a 3-year-old would never get more than 3 minutes of timeout. That's a general rule of thumb. I'm going to talk more about timeout here in a bit in the context of some of your questions. And then finally, we'll talk about ignoring in a little bit, but finally, is the piece or the concept of consistency. This is probably one of the most important things that you can talk about when it comes to true discipline, because we want things as humans to work the first time we try them, and unfortunately, that's not always the way it goes. And generally speaking, things need to be tried out a couple of weeks before we move on to a new strategy. And the last slide I wanted to show you was just this concept of reinforcement. A lot of times when people hear something like reinforcement, they think I'm buying you something, I'm giving you something that costs money. And there are actually 3 types of reinforcers. Only one of them is tangible, meaning that I purchase and hand you something. The other 2 are social reinforcers and natural reinforcers. Social reinforcers is simply you express approval of behavior. Teachers do this all the time, telling kids good job for something that they have attempted. So you worked hard. I'm glad you took deep breaths and calmed down. That's a social reinforcer. And then a natural reinforcer is something that happens directly as a result of the behavior. And this is the one I like to pay attention to the most. Because the concept of natural reinforcers is that you basically are reinforced by whatever happens next. So as an example, let me give you an example of a good natural reinforcer is if you speed when you're driving. As an adult, we could speed if we want to. And we are quite aware that sometimes when we speed, we might get speeding tickets and sometimes we might not, but we still have an active choice about whether or not we're going to go over the speed limit. A natural reinforcer would be a speeding ticket. It's the thing that occurs next. We don't have to like it. It can be bad. It can be good. Consequences to the behavioral choices we make are just what happens next. So I really like natural reinforcers, and I will spend some time talking about that. But before I move into all of the questions that I had in your registration, did any of that trigger any things that anybody wants to say or wants me to go into any more detail about before I start answering your questions? And if not, it's looking like maybe no. I'll start answering some of your questions because you had a lot of really excellent questions. So there were a number of questions related to parenting children who are on the spectrum, so who have Asperger's or autism or maybe an intellectual disability. And some of you asked questions about parenting children with things like ADHD. So a couple of rules of thumb for children who might be on the spectrum or who might have an intellectual disability. First and foremost, it's breaking down your expectations into smaller chunks. So regardless of that child's age, just putting things in smaller chunks, basically. So if I said to the average 8-year-old, go to your room, grab your shoes, get your backpack, brush your teeth, come back down here, put your shoes on, and then get in the car, I might expect that the average 8 to 10-year-old would be able to do that. And if my child had an intellectual disability or was on a spectrum, I might need to break that into a slightly smaller chunk. So I might need to say, run upstairs, get your backpack, brush your teeth, or go upstairs, brush your teeth. And then I follow them and say, grab your backpack, grab your shoes. And then once we're downstairs, I might then say, put on your shoes and get in the car. So you just chunk things in a little bit smaller groupings. Another really helpful tool with, I think actually all children, but again, in particular, this group is related to rewarding as you go through a particular type of event. So let's say that you wanted to go somewhere and do something with a child who had difficulty with their behavior in that setting prior. So you know that it's hard for them to go do this thing because they often misbehave. Then you would preset a plan. So as an example, I can remember doing with a family one time, basically a candy necklace. And so, or maybe it was Cheerios, I've forgotten now, but we put some kind of food item on a necklace that the child wore through the whole day, like outside day fair. And every time some sort of behavioral refusal occurred, they had to eat a piece of candy off of their necklace. But the rule was if they managed to get home with their necklace having at least 10 pieces of candy on it, they earned a particular type of reward. So it was a physical reminder throughout their whole day of how well they were doing. And it also allowed the parent the ability to consistently remind them to sort of redirect them to behaving well. So you might be able to say, you've got 15 pieces left on your necklace. I don't want you to lose another piece for arguing with me. Because remember, if you keep 12 pieces, you're going to be tonight. So I want you to change your attitude and stop arguing. And then they have this physical reminder to hold on to, which is very important for some particular children. And you'll often know if your child responds well to that simply by trying it. So a lot of discipline strategy figuring out is actually just trying it with your child and seeing if they respond well, and if they don't, moving on to a new sort of strategy or task. Another kind of rule of thumb is that often children like this are very one-to-one. So things need to be if this, then that. And I actually like this for pretty much all children, to be quite honest. And I call it often if-then parenting. And so you're able to consistently have conversations with your kid along the lines of, if you do that, then this thing happens. If you do this, then this thing happens. So if your child were arguing with you at Walmart about whether or not they could have a piece of candy, you'd be able to say, if you keep arguing with me, we're leaving and you have to clean your room. If you stop arguing with me, when we go home, you can have a donut that we already have at home. And so your child has two very clear choices. And obviously what you've done is attach the positive reinforcement to the behavior you want them to do. So you're sort of trying to direct them to choose the thing you want them to choose. And then on the other, the behavior you don't want them to do, you've attached the negative consequence, right? So you're trying to help them choose what you want them to choose. The downside to this kind of parenting is that obviously some kids sometimes are going to choose the one you don't want them to choose, and you have to be ready to stick with whatever you told them was going to happen next. So earlier when I was talking about consequences and I said consequences are just what happens next, this is the sort of real life look at what that might look like with a child. Is you tell them what the consequences are, they choose their consequence. It's actually on them to make the choice. And that can work with all ages of children, all styles of children, all problematic behaviors. Just as parents, we have to be ready to hold out when they make the choice we kind of wish they didn't. Over time, they will learn to make better choices. A lot of people also talked about, what do I do when my child says things like, I don't need your help, or they're being disrespectful when you are, or they're back talking when you're trying to discipline them, educate them, or redirect them, and that sort of thing. One of my favorite ways to manage that sort of behavior, particularly things like back talking, is remember, every behavior is meaningful, right? Some sort of need is being met by the behavior that they're engaging in. So if I've told my child not to do something and they are constantly arguing with me about it, and I am arguing back with them, I'm engaged with them. They've got my full attention. So one of the first things I try to do when a child is back talking or just arguing nonstop is I completely remove my attention. So if that were to be the need that is being met and you pull it back, they're going to really quickly change their behavior and find a new way to get your attention onto them. And I'm not saying again that that works for every child every time, but it's almost always the first thing I try, because that's such a common thing that we see when we're talking to parents or working with kids. So I'm definitely a judicious proponent of walking away and removing your attention when children aren't behaving in ways that sort of earn your attention in that particular scenario. Also, lots of reminders about what potential consequences exist. So if your child is back talking you or is arguing nonstop and you say, I'm not talking to you when you talk to me like this, I'm going to be in the kitchen doing whatever it is you're going to be doing. When you can talk to me in a nice voice, I will talk to you again. And then you go to the kitchen. And I know what all of you are thinking, what if they follow me? Like, put your metaphorical, headphones on. So you do have to outlast them. So if your child is just a young child and they haven't displayed any sort of behavioral sorts of issues, this is going to work quick and fast. If your child has a mental health issue or concern, or you're already dealing with behavior and you're trying to recorrect or fix that behavior, this is a way harder process. So understand that parents are at very different levels when it comes to this ability to put on your pretend headphones and ignore the behavior, because sometimes what you're ignoring is just them huffing and talking under their breath. And sometimes what you're trying to ignore is them yelling and screaming. And those are two very different things. So there has to be a little tweaking there, obviously, to make that fit and work for your family. But your attention is a very powerful reinforcer across the board, even when you're, and this was another question that I saw, even when your child says they don't care. That's just not true. They'll say it, and again, there are reasons that they say things like that, but it's just not true. What we know about kids is negates that and tells us that that is not a true sentiment. I see a question that just popped up that said, can you remove your child to their room rather than removing yourself? That one's a little bit trickier. The short answer is yes. So if they were talking back to you and you wanted to say, I'm not talking to you when you're talking like this, you go to your room and play, I'm going to the kitchen and cooking dinner, we'll talk later when you've calmed down and I've calmed down. Yes, absolutely. So if you can just send them there, the trick is to make it not a punishment, right? So if you send them to their room because they're in trouble, that's going to trigger more arguing with you. So what you want to do is make sure that they understand you've not gotten to the point of punishment or rewards or consequence. You're simply stopping, if that makes sense. So the short answer to that is yes. The longer answer is you got to be a little tricky in the way you do it to make sure that they don't just get more argumentative with you. Let's see. There were some questions around the teenage years and how do you hold them essentially accountable? Or not how do you hold them accountable, but specific to teens, how does this sort of translate into the teenage years, these things that we're talking about? And one of the biggest things I would say is be prepared for them to make the choice that has the sort of more negative consequence attached to it, solely because they're teenagers, and that to some degree is what they do. You can hold them accountable, but you have to allow sort of for the follow through. They're going to test you on whether or not you're going to apply or allow that negative consequence to occur. I would also say allow for natural consequences, and that can be a really hard one because you love your children and you'd like to protect them from, any of the bad things that might happen in life. But there were some questions related to specifically aggressive behavior. So beyond back talking, but your child was being actively aggressive. If they were at school and they attacked somebody and were an aggressor and the police got called, whatever natural consequence occurs because of that, sometimes we have to take a step back and allow that to occur, because the reality of it is you can't always protect them from those things, and you don't have the power and control to do that in many situations. So sometimes the natural consequences that occur because of the behavioral choices we make are what happens, and we can't always control that. The hope is obviously that we're catching it before that, so that they learn way earlier that there are consequences to that sort of thing. When we're talking about applying these concepts to a really little one, so like this one says 19 months old, and then the concept that they're not regulating very well, and obviously the language wouldn't be there to have these conversations. And that's a really good question. One of the things I would say is I like to pay attention to two things. One of them is the way in which a child is breathing, like literally how they're breathing. And the other one is how calm their body is. Like if it's really tense and tight, and I don't know if you can see what I'm doing, versus really loose. The reason for that is that biologically, human bodies cannot be angry and tight and calm at the same time. We cannot be calm and not calm at the same time. We can only be one way or the other. So if your child is having trouble regulating, one of the absolute first things I do with pretty much every child I've ever met is I hand them a set of bubbles. Because conceptually, when you try to blow giant bubbles, you take a really big deep breath in and you blow a really long breath out, which is calm breathing. And when we're not calm, our breath is not like that. The other is do some sort of fun activity, like you could call it all sorts of things. So I call it robot and ragdoll because I'm old, but you'll hear other people call it like stiff cooked spaghetti, or stiff uncooked spaghetti versus, cooked spaghetti. And you make kids get like a robot, and then you make them a rag doll. Because again, if you can get their body to be calm, the rest of them will eventually follow. So that 19-month-old doesn't have to know any of these strategies. You would still narrate it so that they would hear those words really early on. But you don't have to expect them to understand. Really what you'd be trying to do is help them learn how to regulate their body by doing something with their breath and by doing something with their actual body. Hopefully that made sense. And one of the other things I'd say is I'm talking specifically at that moment about a really little kid, but if you're 30 and you walk into my office, I'm probably still going to give you bubbles. So I think most people don't pay good enough attention to how to make their body be calm when they're upset, because you're allowed to be upset. That's acceptable. You're allowed to be angry. That's acceptable, but you have to make the right choice about how to express that. So that's a good tool to teach little ones, but even older ones if they're having trouble with it. There were some questions specifically to like, I want my child to do something specific like hygiene. One of my most common recommendations when it comes to something like trying to get through like a hygiene routine or something like that is what we call a behavior chart. And that's probably rings lots of bells for many of you, but the essential sort of rule of thumb would be you tell them what you expect them to do, and then once they've done it, there is a consequence for that. And in this case, a positive one. So if you wanted your child to do 5 hygiene steps, do some sort of picture chart or word chart that shows each of those hygiene steps, and every day that they hit all 5 of them, they get a positive consequence or a positive reinforcement. And from what I said at the very beginning, you know what that means is they are more likely to do that thing again because they were positively reinforced for it. And I think you can apply that to pretty much any behavior that you want to see more of, whatever that behavior might be. Sit quietly at church, go to your grandmother's house without complaining, literally anything, attach some sort of positive consequence to it, and you're more likely to see the behavior you're after. Let's see. Oh, another thing I want to say about that is that needs to reset itself every day. So if your child isn't successful one day when it comes to completing their hygiene chart, that has no bearing on whether or not they get their positive consequence the second day. Those things need to reset because children's, and particularly again, when we go back to that ADHD presentation that somebody had asked about, children's capacity to hold that on a long-term basis is not well developed. So things need to be close together. Behaviors and consequences need to be close together, and they need to be pretty clear, and we don't need to stretch them out too much over time. Obviously, the older your child, the longer they can hold that, but really young children, it needs to be pretty immediate. Like, you cleaned up your toys, here's what happens when you clean up your toys, versus a teenager who you might be able to say, if you get in no fights for 5 days at school, this is what happens on Saturday or Sunday. They can hold that, like they can wait, but little kids can't. Close together is better. Let's see. One of the things that often also comes up in relation to the questions that you asked was, what do I do when they say they don't care? Or what do I do when they say or do this particular type of thing? And then how do I get them to stop arguing with me when I'm like arguing back with them? Like that sort of thing. And one of the things I always like to point out when it comes to that is, one, you're human too. And if someone is arguing with you, we're pretty wired to argue back with them, whether they're our child or the child we're taking care of or not. So when you think about it and you're like, oh, I didn't do that exactly the way that I wanted to, I think it's really awesome for kids to see adults own that and have an adult say to them, not the way I meant to say that. I apologize for what I said. And here's how we're going to like correct it and move forward. Because that's an excellent time for you to be able to model what you want them to actually do. Because kids who are having troubles with behavioral issues usually have a lot of repairing to do with the people around them once they get control of their behavior, because they're going to have upset a lot of people, other kids, teachers, you a lot of the time. So modeling for them the ability to do that can be a really, really positive thing, particularly if they do have those behavioral issues in other settings, because other people probably aren't likely to model for them what that looks like. They're just going to get mad at them and walk away. I did like one person asked, why is behavior worse with consequences? And I think that's a fabulous question. And this is what happens almost always when you try to change up how you discipline your child. There's a real name for this. It's called an extinction burst. But basically what this is it's testing. So like, let's pretend that you got paid right now at your job to work for 10 hours. And your boss came in one day and was like, I need you to work 2 extra hours, but I'm still going to pay you for 10. And you're like, okay, but just this week. And then they kept growing it and growing it and growing it. At some point, like you're going to start testing that, right? You're going to start leaving after 10 hours because they're not paying you for more than 10 hours. And what would happen over time is that when your boss was like, no, you have to do 15, you work 15, you might throw a fit or you might lose control of your behavior. That's called an extinction burst. It's basically this time frame where you get way worse, actually usually than you were before, because the person who is trying to change your behavior is trying to change your behavior. So the primary thing to do when that sort of thing occurs, when you change how you're trying to discipline, is outlast them. They're just trying to see if you're going to give in or back off on this change that you've made. That goes back to that thing when I was talking about earlier when it came to consistency. It's why it's so important. I'm not saying that's easy, don't get me wrong. I say it as if that's an easy thing to do, and I recognize that it's not, but it is a really known thing. We know that happens when it comes to behavior change. There were some questions from several people around things like hitting at different age ranges, like little kids and older kids, and things like bad language. And I wasn't sure how old that child was. But I did think that might be a helpful part of the conversation. And what I mean about that is that there are certain behaviors, even when we don't like them, but they are actually developmentally appropriate, normal for that child's age range, even though we don't like the behavior. An example of that is hitting. Young children, like babies, in preschool or daycare, hit and bite. And not all children do it. Some kids never bite. Some kids have problems with biting for many years until they finally get control of it. So one of the things you have to do when you look at behaviors like that is know, is this a normal behavior for children of this age? And if it is, you address it just like all these other things that we've been talking about so far. So you might say, we don't bite our friends. And if you bite your friend, then you don't earn your whatever it might be. And if they're so young that they don't have language, it's literally picking them up and moving them. So it's like, we don't bite our friends. And then you move them over to play by themselves. And so that same concept of if-then parenting is actually occurring pre-language very, very early, because what that child learned is when I bite, I don't get to play with my friends, even though they don't have the language to express or understand that. That's what they actually learned, because somebody moved me away from my fins because I put my mouth on them. And you used verbal language to explain that that's why you did, because eventually they will have the verbal language to explain that. The bad language one is an interesting one, because that is also developmentally not appropriate. That's not the right word, but developmentally common in older kids, like middle school and high school. Because it's, well, there's lots of reasons for that. I won't get into it, but it's not an uncommon occurrence at that particular age level. And then when you have kids who are striving really hard to be at that level, like maybe pre-adolescent, sometimes they will do it because it makes them feel cool, like the high schoolers. So normally what I will do is encourage people to have a conversation with their older kids, that's something along the lines of, you know that some behaviors are okay in certain places and not others. I don't allow cursing in my house. So I can't stop you from cursing when you're with your friends. I don't want you to, but you really can't stop that. You can't, you're not even going to know it's happening, but you can tell them you can't do that in my house. And here is the consequence of choosing to do it in my house. And then you have to let the friend situation go, because you will not ever even know what's happening. And most kids, when we're not talking about behavioral issues or mental health issues, most kids can conceptually understand that certain behaviors are only allowed in certain places and not others. That's not a difficult concept for them, because they have school and home and this person's house and that person's house, and their moms are different. That's something that's a normal part of a lot of their lives. One of the other things that I think I'll tack on to this was related to, several of you asked questions about, like, maybe my child is anxious, or maybe they talk a lot about feeling like a failure when they continuously do things they're not supposed to do. And how do we as parents enforce those consequences without making them feel like they have failed? And so what I generally like to do in those situations is make sure that you verbally remind your children that the thing that you don't like or that you don't want to see anymore is the behavior. And behavior is not the end all be all of who we are. Like, we are people who have lots of things that are great about us, and sometimes we behave in ways that other people might not like. And so it's really important to help children understand that a bad behavior day does not equal failure. It means a bad day, and tomorrow is a whole brand new day. And if you do it differently, you won't feel like this tomorrow. So what we want to do is contain that feeling essentially to the event that led to it, and not let it spread into the rest of that child's understanding of who they are and what their world is like. So every day needs to be new when it comes to this concept of discipline and behavioral planning. Again, you are human, so it doesn't mean that you just forget that hurtful thing your child said to you yesterday every day. Like, I know that you don't, but from a behavioral perspective, as best we can, start each day new. That's important. Let's see. You had so many good questions. I'm not even sure which ones to hit here. And I'm not seeing any new additional ones in the chat, so I'll just keep going, but please stop me if you want me to go into more detail about any particular issue, age range, etc. But otherwise, I'll just keep going. Let's see, several of you talked about the concept of having to be repetitive, like repeat yourself many times in order to get your child to do something. Some of you linked that to ADHD. Some of you just said your child required lots of repetition. And there's a couple of different schools of thought around that. And some of it is just that every child is different, just like all adults are different. Every child is distinctly different. Some kids need more repetition than others, and it's not negative. You might not love it, but it's not necessarily negative. Now, in the context of a behavioral disorder or a behavioral problem, that's a whole different sort of situation. But having to repeat things is not inherently incorrect in terms of your child's behavior, particularly for kids with something like ADHD. Their attention span is not that of another child of the same age. They actually do need repetition. It's a function of the disorder, not the specific child. I always think about that. It's kind of a weird concept, but I think of that like adults in the sense that, you know, I could look at a piece of cake and gain 5 pounds, and my friend could eat 5 cakes and gain nothing. Like, we're all just really, really different. And kids are the same when it comes to stuff like needing repetition in order to learn something or hear something correctly. What I will say is, if your child seems to have particular difficulty with that, you could try something visual. Maybe they're just not processing things exactly the right way. And if you added a visual picture or some sort of reminder that's not just verbal, but visual too, you might get better results out of that. It's hard to know, like every kid's different, and I would need to meet that child to have really specific recommendations. But that's one thing I might suggest just in general. Oh, and then obviously chunking smaller amounts of directions like we'd already talked about. One of the other really frequent sets of questions that you had was, what if my kid says no when I give them a direction? This is going to depend on the child's age, but the general rule of thumb is always, every time your child is starting to make a behavioral choice that is one you don't want, that's negative, or that you're uncomfortable with, or is not the one you want them to make, first response to that, other than redirection, like don't talk back or something like that, would always be a behavioral sort of reminder that there are consequences to certain things. So if you told your child it's time to stop playing video games and they said no, your first response to that could be, do you want to change the way you said that? Because if you don't stop, the thing that happens next is this. If you do stop, we'll go all have dinner and you won't be in trouble. Like, you remind them what the potential consequences are to the behavioral choice they're about to make, because you want that to be fresh in their mind before they make the choice that they're going to make. So if you just said, yes, get off your video games, that is the first precursor to starting the argument, if that makes sense. So like right now, you probably could feel like what kind of response you wanted to give me to both of those types of worded ways to stop playing video games. So one is more of an argument starter. One is more of a, I'm going to give you an opportunity to change what you're saying and go the route of a good consequence. The obvious sort of like, that's not going to work every time situation is that sometimes kids are still going to choose to argue with you and not get off their video game. Then you move away from the concept of adding positive rewards or positive consequences. Then you've moved into the punishment world. So you can see sort of, you start in this positive consequence world where you give kids ample opportunity to make the choice you want them to make that have positive outcomes. And when they don't do it that way, that's when you end up in the punishment world. But you start the other way first, simply because we know that's what works best as a behavioral changer, as what changes kids' behaviors. Let's see. There were lots of individual questions about how to get your child to do a very specific behavior. Like, I want my child to do this thing or that thing. I'm going to say the answer to all of those questions comes down to the attachment of consequences. If you want your child to do a specific behavior, attach a consequence to it that they want. If you want them to stop doing a specific behavior, attach a consequence to it that they do not want. That is the first and easiest way to change a specific behavior. It's another style of one-to-one parenting. So if I want my child to get ready and go to school every morning without arguing with me, the only way they get to watch TV in my house is if they went to school without an argument. The side consequence to that is when they argue with you, you don't get to watch TV either, unless you can like hide in your room and watch TV. So sometimes you got to pick your consequence that is both one that they want or that you want to punish them with, but it's one you can withstand too. Because if you tell your child you only get to watch TV if you go to school without arguing, and then you let them watch TV, you've undone all of your hard work. So that's where the consistency piece comes in too, because all your child would have learned in that particular scenario was, it doesn't matter what so-and-so says, if I argue or not, I still got to watch TV. So there was a break in between your telling them what the consequence was and then it actually happening, which is also why the closer you put them together, the better it is, because there's less chance for that break, because you never know what's going to happen in your day. Any detailed questions about that? Oh, I'm seeing, what are other creative ways to help my 8-year-old who has Asperger's with not crying when receiving instruction or discipline from others who insist him at school? So he cries, gets down on himself. Yeah. Okay, that one's a hard one. So generally speaking, what I would say in response to a child who like cries when people discipline them or give them instructions, is essentially to have that reminder that, and again, this, I'm going to say this as if I were a parent and you need to alter it to be a school teacher or something like that. No, I'll say it as if I were a school teacher. So if I needed to discipline that child, what those individuals need to do is be saying something like, I'm going to make up a name. Let's say his name was John. They need to be saying, John, you're not allowed to do blank thing. I need you to do other blank thing. And then if he's crying, say, it's okay to cry. I know that you're upset about that you got in trouble for this, but remember, you're learning. And then next time you'll remember not to do this. So it's almost like allowing them to have the feelings they have, but making sure that they understand there's more chances. Doing it incorrectly one time doesn't have any bearing on your ability to do it the next time. And then if at all possible, the next time they did it correctly, you'd want to point that out. And again, every child is different. So that might not even apply to your particular 8-year-old. That might have been too much language for your 8-year-old. And so that might need some adjustment. In terms of worrying about rewarding or using food as a consequence, like with the necklace example, that's a good question. Yes, sometimes actually. So not every child is motivated by items, like things that they see. Sometimes your child might have diabetes, or you might be working on like a body positivity plan or something like that, and you don't want food as any sort of connection to what you're doing. Just shift that, switch that out. So rather than it being a food item, make it any other thing. So I have parents that I work with right now who carry stickers around in like literally everything they own, in their purses, in their pockets, in their backpacks. They have stickers everywhere, and they're sticking stickers to stuff at all times because stickers equal things in that family. So every night when they like pull all of the pieces of paper out of everywhere, how many ever stickers that kids has buys things in their house or in their family. So yes, not all children need to be using food as their anything. And that's a personal decision for each and every family. Food can be a powerful motivator, but you can absolutely avoid it, and you do not have to use it. And you can still have really good results without it. So that's an excellent question. Another question one of you asked was like, what if I need a break and my child catches me in a situation like I'm in the car? And you had said something about like, what if I need a break? Like I'm trying to ignore them, but we're stuck in the car together. How do I handle that? I really liked that question because kids are insanely good at being loud or annoying enough that we can't ignore them. So that's where that whole pretend thing on your ears example comes from, is just doing the best that you can. And when they push you far enough that you end up yelling or something like that, owning that when it happens, coming back later and saying, didn't mean to yell at you, I got really upset, I apologize for yelling. Now let's talk about this thing that you've, whatever that behavior was that needed to have a consequence, so that it can't be successful. That's the most important thing. So the fact that they got you to get so angry that you yelled at them cannot be the reason that you don't apply a consequence, because what they learn in that instance is, if I can get my mom so mad that she yells at me, I don't get in trouble, because then she feels bad. So the most important thing in all of these examples is that you come back to it whenever you're able to. Whatever it is that required you a break, you got to come back to it at some point. The other thing that I would add to that is, remember that children do not have to like the consequences that you are applying. They don't have to agree with you, because many of you ask questions along the lines of, they just keep telling me it's not fair, it's never their fault. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You as an adult are very well aware that many things in life are not fair and are not your fault. And we're required to follow those rules anyways. Children don't live in that world yet because they're children. So you're the parent. And if they don't like the rule that you've established, that is acceptable. They do not have to like it. However, they have to choose to follow it, because you have attached consequences to not following it that they don't want to get. So don't feel like you have to make your child like all of the things that you were establishing. It's perfectly fine if they don't. Let's see, we only have about 10 minutes left, so please direct me. I'm going to keep going, but there's so many questions. I know I'm not going to get to all of them, but please provide me any direction if you want me to go somewhere specific. Let's see, I see a question about helping a spouse. Oh, and your spouse and yourself, and how to respond. Would removing something he enjoys, like electronics or certain toys, for a period of time be a bad discipline choice? Would it just cause trigger behaviors on repeat? That's a good question too. So you can effectively use the removal of something if it's the consequence to the behavior. So I talk a lot about positive reinforcement only because I know it's what works best to change behavior, but sometimes that's not feasible, because some children don't respond well to positive reinforcement. Some children, you try to positively reinforce them and their behavior escalates to the point that they end up earning themselves a punishment. So I recognize that sometimes the removal is what you have to do. And that's actually fine. The most important thing for you to remember is what you're always trying to do is attach a consequence to the choice you want them to make that will be more likely to make them make that choice. I only say positive reinforcement because that's way easier to do as a parent. So if I want my child to stop playing video games, I want to attach a consequence to that that makes them choose to stop playing video games. Does that make sense? So the reverse of that is, if you were trying to remove something from them, you have to think about that as the consequence that is attached to the behavior that you want to go up. So if I want to remove your PlayStation, you have to, this is why it's so much trickier to remove things, is because how do I remove something in order to make a behavior go up, right? So I won't say that you can't remove things, but I would say always think of removing something as a punishment, not as a thing that will make a behavior go up. And start with the thing that makes a behavior go up. Punishment comes second. So you have to use it. Every child gets punished. Me, you, all of us have been punished at some point. So I'm not saying don't use it. I'm saying try the other first. And then when you have to, you use punishment as well. How do you handle the hitting, kicking, screaming, biting? So any sort of defiant behavior. Essentially in the same sort of way. So that behavior should always earn a particular type of consequence, but you need to tell them that and then remind them of that when they're about to make that choice. If it's in the midst of it and they're already screaming and kicking, obviously you can't say, you're going to earn a consequence, because they can't hear you. All you can do is behaviorally manage that, remove the other children that they're biting or hitting, remove yourself, push them in, not literally, I don't mean push, I meant like move away, but put them in whatever location that is safe for them. And then when they're calm, you come back to it. So in that moment, if they've already gotten into the spot of their hitting and kicking and screaming, in that moment, you can do nothing but behaviorally control that. Once you have all gotten calm, you come back and you say, you hit and kicked and screamed, and you know that you can't do that. The consequence for hitting and kicking and screaming is that your brother picks the movie tonight, not you. That's always the consequence for hitting and kicking. And then you apply the consequence. And then in the future, if you start to see them starting to go down that hill, you remind them of the consequence. You try to catch it ahead of them actually starting that behavior. And we're never successful all the time, but every time you can catch it before they start to go down that hill, and you remind them of what the consequences that will occur, you can stop it before it gets there. It won't happen every time. We just do our best to try to catch it on its way down. Let's see, I saw a question around, where'd that go? A 19-month-old who is violent. Yeah, actually, in terms of getting violent at 19 months, you would be trying to get him to learn to control his body. At 19 months, I would be using language like, you can't hit when you're mad. It's okay that you're mad. I can tell that you got mad when Sarah took your toy. You got mad when Sarah took your toy, but you can't hit Sarah. And then you remove that child from both Sarah and the toy. The most important thing would be that they don't get the toy, right? Because why is the violent behavior present? When you're thinking about behavior and it having meaning, what did that behavior get them? Behavior is maintained by the consequences that occur after. So whatever is happening after your child gets violent is what's maintaining that behavior. And the one other thing I would say about this is that these are like really broad general rules of thumb. And if you're having difficulty, I know Pam mentioned it at the beginning, but this is what I do. This is what a lot of us do as our jobs. So if you're having particular difficulty with your child around this, find a provider you like. There's therapists in all communities, everywhere any of you might live, who can actually tailor this specifically to your child or your children. And they'd be able to go into a lot more detail about what will actually work with your specific child. But hopefully in this, broad selection of stuff, you heard a few things that you can sort of pull from. In the last, I think maybe 3 minutes or 2 minutes, I'll just look and make sure there weren't any major areas that I did not hit on. I guess one of them is allow yourself to be frustrated. Parenting, like I said at the very beginning, is a very hard task. So you're allowed to be frustrated and angry and all of the things that you feel while you're, trying to do this discipline task. That's normal. Somebody had asked something about promoting good behavior at school. That's an if-then task. So if you have good behavior at school, then this is what happens when you get home. That's a really straightforward one. Oh, one last one. This is what I think I'll end on because I haven't hit on this. Someone had asked about how do I discipline when I'm co-parenting with a different household? That's a really good question. And what I would say is that sometimes if you can communicate between the two households, everything's fine. You communicate, you have agreements about what's acceptable, what's not, and you do normal parenting. When you don't have the ability to have agreement across the households, you've only got a couple of options open to you. One of them is that for older children, they again understand the concept of there are different rules in different places. So absolutely having conversations with them about there's just different rules in different places. At this house, this is the rule. At this house, this is the rule. And this is the consequence for breaking the rule at this house. If you break that rule at that house, that's a consequence there. Kids are capable of that. Sometimes they need a little bit of help, but they are absolutely capable of that concept. Younger children, that can be a little bit difficult. It doesn't mean that you can't talk to them about that and tell them, well, these are the rules at this house. They're different there, just like your rules are different at school, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes you're just waiting on a new developmental stage. If your child is really, really young and you can't explain that to them, it just might be a little bit of a rough patch. Eventually, your kids will hit a developmental stage where you'll be able to talk to them about that. But if you've just got no communication with the other house, sometimes that's just kind of what you're stuck with until your child can have a little bit of that conversation with you. If you do what we've talked about, though, on your end, and you do a lot of that positive reinforcement, you can do this successfully without being the like harsh or like the unfun parent, because you're still applying lots of positive stuff. So I thought that was a great question.
Very good. Oh, Abby, so many good tips and pieces of information. Thank you so much. I just wanted to share a couple of quick tidbits before, as we're wrapping up tonight. Just a reminder, if you need a certificate of attendance or completion for this, and if you haven't typed your first and last name in the chat box, please be sure to do that. And if you know of anyone, I mentioned this earlier, if you know of anyone who you think would benefit, if you talking to some of your friends and neighbors, we will post this video as well as Abby's PowerPoint presentation on the fsgctopeka.com website. You can get to it by clicking there's a big blue button on the right-hand side, and it says Parent Resources. So that will happen tomorrow. And real quickly, I wanted to share my screen super fast, and hopefully I can do it correctly this time. So wanted to make sure that you all were aware. We still have a program, free program available for anyone who might be struggling with a variety of different things due to COVID-19. You know, our numbers going up and down, and you know, we're not, unfortunately, out of this yet. So, you know, this program, it's called Kansas Stronger Together. It is free, can help anyone who's struggling to get connected to resources. So if, you know, you're feeling isolated or lonely, feeling stressed, lost your job, or in jeopardy of losing your apartment or house, anything like that, this black box here, please feel free to reach out for help. The fsgctopeka.com/stronger. You just submit a little bit of contact information, and one of our staff members will get back to you and help you in any way that we can. So please know that this is a resource available to anyone in Shawnee County that just has been negatively impacted by COVID-19. Lastly, I will stop sharing here. Lastly, so we have one more real world, that's a hard thing to say at 7:30, real world parenting conversation next month, December. It is entitled A Parent's Survival Guide to the Middle School Years. So if you have a middle schooler or soon to be middle schooler, that might be something to put on your calendar. It will be Thursday, December 16th, again from 6:30 to 7:30 on Zoom. More information will be put up on our Facebook page and website after this event, obviously. But thank you so much for your time, Abby. This was fantastic. I see a lot of thank you, all this great stuff. So I really appreciate everyone's time, and take good care and enjoy the Thanksgiving holiday with your families and friends. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.